everybody, Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share my full review, the digitally digested segment for the Sony Alpha A7 Mark II. This camera is priced at $1,700 US for the body alone and $2,000 for the kit that I unboxed in the past. In terms of what you're actually getting, well, this is the successor to the original A7, Sony's first full-frame mirrorless interchangeable lens camera, based around the E-mount, which was arguably a game changer to say the least. So high expectations for the refresh, and in my opinion, I'll tell you right now at the beginning of this review, the A7 Mark II is an impressive camera, and at its price point, unmatched in the industry like the A7 before it. However, for my own personal needs, it's not the camera for me, and I'll get to that later if you're interested to actually know why. But this review is clearly more focused on trying to help you answer whether or not the camera is right for you, so let's stick with that. In terms of what Sony did on this refresh, key critical enhancements, first and foremost, the biggest thing, the most impressive, 5-axis image stabilization, works up to 3 ways with non-native glass. Support really will vary depending on whether or not your lens can communicate via a third-party adapter to the body itself. But the whole point is that now anyone who had glass from any make or model manufacturer can basically just about natively get stabilization with an Alpha full-frame mirrorless body, which before this camera was simply impossible. No in-body stabilization on any E-mount camera before the one you're looking at here. Also, for Sony lenses like the FE full-frame E-mount 24 to 70 f4 Zeiss glass you're looking at here, it means even more stabilization, extra stops in the still world, as well as improved stabilization in video as well. And it really is impressive. I have to say, it's Sony embracing what they've always done well, which is video on these sort of E-mount bodies now in the full-frame realm, and they're just getting better and better at it. That's why you've got the same 24-megapixel sensor, a slightly improved LCD here that now has bumped up resolution, but still basically the same range of articulation, a little bit slimmer or thinner than the previous gen, which you'll see in a moment on the A7R. Still weather sealed, but a vast improvement for most users, I would say, in terms of the actual build quality and design. And that's because you now have a substantially larger grip. The shutter button has been relocated to the front of the grip, which I think most users find more natural. I've been a little bit conditioned by the A7 and A7R, as well as the fact that I don't have incredibly large hands. I'll talk about that later. That's more about my own personal impression. But the idea here is that Sony wanted a grip that could easily help support the larger glass that they are planning to launch and just announced officially, even though they already announced it last year at CES. And with all of that extra glass, that's why you see the 70 to 200G right here. It's one of the largest, or it is the largest native E-mount glass right now that you can buy, that is full frame, of course, as well, FE designated. You just didn't have a grip. It's a matter of fact. You can see the A7R here. It's got a grip that would be nice to have on the RX1, but on a camera that's interchangeable and really has full frame capability and now lenses to match, a library slowly growing here, a larger grip was definitely necessary. So I think this was a huge design improvement. Sony basically listening to consumers and answering their wants, their needs. In terms of changing button layouts, a little bit, not a tremendous, but still a noteworthy change and deviation. Keep in mind that the Alpha full frame line was only 1 generation old, so it's not like they had this same design for many, many years. But in terms of the buttons, you can see right here, I'll just bring the A7R up, and I already did give a first look at these two cameras side by side when I first received the A7 Mark II, and even though this is the A7R on the right, it still is identical in terms of button layout and at least what it aesthetically looks like compared to the A7 that the Mark II is replacing. So you can see exposure comp, same place, but now we've got the C2 and C1 buttons in a different place over here on the body of the Mark II. The traditional mode dial, nothing really has been modified there, no need. Shutter button on the R is actually on the power button, which is mounted on the top frame of the body, rather than on the grip, which it's now been relocated to completely. Also, the dials have changed. You can see right here on the Mark II, we've got a front dial on the grip, customizable, as well as on the back, which is right there. I'm using the R as a pointing device. Those became plastic dials as opposed to the polished, I would say metal, or I'll just call them metallic ones that we had with the original series, which I think are far better in terms of look, feel, and operation. But it's a matter of personal preference. Again, keep in mind that the actual body here, I said it's bigger, it's heavier, it's sturdier. I mean, just look at the actual base of this camera, compare it with the R. I'm carefully doing this here. And you instantaneously see that Sony is after another market. They're trying to reaffirm to pros, enthusiasts, everyone out there that this is a serious piece of photographic equipment. It's not just a marketing spec or bragging right, a gimmick to show that we can cram this much quality into this small a body. It's that we can really replace the gear you've been using for years. And because these cameras were always meant to work with other lenses, even if it was in a manual capacity with adapters, the whole point is now with this 5-axis stabilization, you legitimately have a real reason to want this beyond the fact that you've got a great sensor at a great price. Also, video department, it's a bump up. We got xavc-s. We do have higher quality video at 1080p. So definitely better than the traditional AVC HD that you'll have in the original A7, A7R. Of course, not the A7S, which can capture 4K, but must do so externally. Also disappointing, even though it is a low-light gem. Another unmatched product. The point is that this weather-sealed beast does leave a lot to be desired in the video category for me personally. That's one area that I was really disappointed. I wanted to see 4K, but clearly Sony is reserving that for another model. And that's why I say that this is really a great foundation, a starting point, much like the original A7 was the basis for a full lineup of cameras that basically had a different target customer in mind, or at least complemented the lineup of cameras that customer was using. And the reason I've got two very different lenses on these bodies is, again, to emphasize the fact of, again, just the overall size, weight, the grip, and what role that plays in the sort of glass you're working with. Traditional E-mount glass, a lot of it looks like this wide angle 10 to 18. It's small, compact, and light, and that's why a grip like the old A7 series had really was beyond adequate for me personally. For many other users, they felt it was too small, larger hands. I get it, I mentioned that. When it comes to a lens like the 70-200, which I'm going to throw on here in a second, show you what that looks like. For me personally, most of my hand-holding, gripping was on the lens itself, so it really wasn't an issue about did I have enough here. There's more troubling things to me, in my mind at least, that this got so much larger. That maybe calls into question the design of the entire first generation and whether or not it can support these heavier lenses that are now part of the evolution of Sony's DI business. But all of that aside, the 24 megapixel sensor in here is still fantastic. The overall autofocus did get a bump up in performance. It's not anything staggering, so we're not seeing the A6000 type performance of 11 frames per second, but we did gain about a frame. Beyond that, more importantly, autofocus tracking has improved substantially. Sony's claiming, I think, about 30% faster, and I can see that. So that is really important in real-world use, whether you're a pro or an entry-level user. And that's what's great about this camera, is that I think everybody from the entry-level to the pro, there's a place for the A7 Mark II, much like the original A7. And as it goes on sale and becomes less expensive, it's just going to be a steal of a piece of kit if you've ever seen one. I mentioned customized buttons changing on the back. We've also got a smaller compartment now for the SD card, SDXC, NFC and Wi-Fi, of course, still on board, access to Sony's Play Memory, application store. The power on time is a little bit faster than the A7, the first generation. In terms of actual shutter speed, or excuse me, the shutter sound, I wanted to just demo that for all of you. So I will. Getting the lens there in focus. So that gives you an idea. And then let's go right into the menu. So I mentioned essentially already what you need to know about specifications. We've got xavc-s now, which is a bump up, but I feel like every Sony user out there agrees this could come in the form of firmware. I mean, the FDR AX100 4K camcorder I'm filming on now that Sony just revamped at CES, or basically refreshed with a smaller model with a higher bit rate, 100 now instead of 60 peak. That already sums it up. The fact that they're going to push firmware to my AX100. I mean, clearly, if the Bion's X processor is in the camera, which it is, it's here in the Mark II, it's in the original Mark I, it's in the R, it's in the S. If all of these cameras have these chips, Sony can fundamentally do something with the firmware, I would imagine. But anyway, moving right along, there's the 60p 50 megabits per second. In terms of basically everything else, I'll just quickly shoot through the menus here so you can see what it looks like. But there's nothing really new here. Most of this is still standard, not a deviation. Sony didn't really have to rewrite the playbook here on actual software and UI. They fixed that. They got that right, starting with the RX line, believe it or not, bringing the A99's interface to all of their cameras in that lineup. And they did a really good job. In terms of video controls, you've got everything you could possibly want. That's another reason that extra image stabilization, the 5-axis, is just amazing to have on a camera this size, even though it is, approaching something larger than what you would traditionally associate an E-mount camera with, even in the full-frame world. It still is substantially smaller than anything you're going to compare it to. And that's what's critical for Sony right now in this market. But everything is here. I'm not showing you anything you haven't already seen if you're a Sony user in the E-mount realm, whether it's APS-C or full frame. And this is really all about just adding more customizations, better video, better stabilization. Battery life didn't improve using the same batteries as every E-mount camera before it. 250, 270 shots. No video overheating problems for me, for those of you that are curious. The NFC is a great convenience, as is Wi-Fi if you actually use it. Some people, though, will never even actually pair it, let alone depend on it for anything. And that's why I mention it in passing rather than an actual bona fide great feature. Of course, 4K clean video output from this device, and that's expected. Sony's been doing that on cameras for years now. Other things to note, you've got quick access, as always, function button. I mean, things have just been relocated. That's what I can tell you best about this camera. Design cues and the bump up in video quality and the 5-axis image stabilization. I mean, that really, even though I've been talking for 14 minutes, almost 13 and a half, about what the Mark II represents, it's really just a bigger, heavier original A7 with better video quality, but still no 4K, which is a disappointment, as well as clearly a build quality that speaks to taking on a higher level, or at least heavier level, of glass. So with that said, let me go ahead and actually remove the Zeiss zoom lens, put that down over here, and bust out the G. And the reason the G is significant is it really did represent one of the first E-mount lenses that was in the class that I've been talking about this whole time, that I think made every Alpha user in the full frame realm, at least, because you really shouldn't buy this for an APS-C. I mean, if you've got an A6000 or another Sony E-mount camera that will natively be able to use this, be my guest. You'll get extra reach out of it, and the quality on this lens is amazing for its form factor, like most of Sony's mirrorless world. But as I said before, I always found myself using the lens almost completely for grip purposes and literally was just shooting, hitting shutter button, but that's about it. I mean, all of my weight was pretty much offset, balanced on the lens itself, and that's the safe way to do it with any camera, frankly. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be able to put some weight on the grip. You should, but that was just me. So having this extra grip is definitely good. I still would not rely on it. I still would want to balance things out. It's the way things should be done, frankly. But bear in mind that if you have smaller hands, I think you're going to find that the grip can become cumbersome. And that's where I spoke to earlier that for me personally, I don't have gigantor hands. So while the grip is going to be embraced by every user that complained the grip wasn't large enough on the previous generation, I personally think the previous generation was just fine. In fact, I do like the design, overall fit and finish much more on the original gen. That will surprise some of you, but most users, which is what Sony is really after, they want numbers here, right? More sales, are going to think this is a higher quality camera simply because of the way it feels. It's heavier, it's all metal, again, weather sealed. The port configuration has changed. We now have a complete redesign. So really this was about changing the look, the feel, and then slightly tweaking performance and video quality, but most importantly, again, adding that 5-axis image stabilization, which is really what separates this beyond what I just mentioned from every other E-mount camera before it. Startup time, I said before, a little bit quicker. Shutter, a little bit quieter, but to me, if you're after a camera like this, the shutter shouldn't be your worry. It's about reducing your weight, but still retaining all of the quality. And all of the extra customizable buttons here are really going to serve you quite well. That's another thing. I mean, if you're going to redo the entire body and bring all of these extra features in order to really make it appeal more to a pro clientele, you need to bring the customization. And even though Sony's UI, as I was showing before, gives you really quick access to everything you could possibly want, they also now give you customization that they simply did not have. I mean, look at the previous gen. You don't have as many customizable buttons. It's as simple as that. I mean, the playback button and the trash, the delete button are the same, but C4, C3 tells you already gained button. I mean, that is critical for some users. Changing the actual menu and, well, this is still a customizable button, a C2 button, giving it that angled build-in on the body there, also part of the redesign of this entire metallic beast. So Sony really wanted to answer on that general question of, is the A7 or does the A7 really have the chops to be a pro-style camera? And I believe that's what the Mark II represents the beginning of. The fact that they had to innovate for the entire industry by adding image stabilization really is just a blessing for just about every photographer on Earth, because the appealing thing for every shooter that I know, whether they were, no matter what manufacturer they were loyal to, they all had an interest in what Sony was doing, but what was holding them back was the fact that there really was no good way to get stabilization for a lens. Manual focus isn't really the problem, at least the complaint that I most frequently heard. So Sony addressed that. So in terms of a short list of what Sony could have done to improve this camera, they pretty much hit a home run, and they did it at a price that is still really palatable when you compare it, again, to just about anything else on the market. The only thing I will note as well is that the vertical grip from the first gen, I unboxed a third-party one, a very affordable one, made by McKay or Mech, will not work with this, nor will Sony's original OEM, their genuine one, because of the redesign of the whole body. But that sort of is a given considering the nature of this camera. And just to give you an idea, you can throw something like this, the small 10 to 18 on there, and immediately the 10 to 18, which already is a small lens, will begin to look like a miniature on this camera. And many will argue that this defeats the purpose of what Sony was always after with the E-mount full frame game. But I disagree. I think they're yet again making a camera for a specific clientele. The A7 has not been discontinued. Is it end of life? Sony is still selling the RX1. I would love to see that revised. So I don't think in Sony's DI world anything is end of life until they actually replace it. And in this case, even though this is really a replacement to the original A7, the A7 isn't going anywhere. It's still on sale. It's still a great camera. So if you're in the market for a full-frame mirrorless interchangeable lens camera, should you buy this instead of the original A7 and save the money? I would say save the money and get the A7 if you actually plan to use Sony's own glass. However, if you are looking from the outside in and have a tremendous amount of Canon, Nikon, whatever make glass you want to use with an adapter, this is absolutely, without hesitation, the camera to pick up. In the same vein, if you already have a collection of E-mount glass, this is again the superior camera to own because you're getting a whole nother level of stabilization with all of your lenses. Keep in mind, some E-mount lenses did not have or do not have stabilization. A lot of the Zeiss glass, even though the zoom lens that I showed before does, the prime lenses often do not. So this is yet another advantage where all of a sudden you're gaining stabilization, aka stops, better overall performance from this body than the original A7. So even though you're getting the same Wi-Fi, processor, sensor, and basically just a rebuild or reconstruct with better video quality, which again is really a software side, a firmware thing in my opinion, unless Sony can speak to otherwise. But the fact that they're able to do a push to the AX100 really tells me a different tale. I think it's clear Sony accomplished what they wanted to begin the foundation for a more professional line. Even though, of course, I thought the A7 lineup was fantastic, clearly they felt that they still had more to prove, and this is the beginning of proving that. You know, retaining the hot shoe, no built-in flash, just like Gen 1. The body style, this entire brick right here, really all originated with the RX1, which I still love and still is my favorite camera, frankly, in the arsenal, which may surprise some of you. And I wish that they would refresh that camera, throw in 4K video, and maybe even make a zoom, ditch the prime, and I think they would have a gem, basically something like what many want the RX20 to be, but let's make it full frame. But that's in a dream world. But for reality, this is really one of the best options, especially when you think about pricing. Remember how low this is starting at, and E-mount glass is only getting less expensive. If you want to use lenses like the wide angle 10 to 18 that's on there right now, you can. It'll be in crop mode. It does have a sweet spot where it will work in full frame, but the full frame lineup is completely maturing over the course of this year. So there are a lot of different options now, and Sony is 100% behind the E-mount. In fact, many would argue it's kind of the death of the A-mount, and R&D and sales do point to that, but I'm not getting into that debate today. It's all about the Mark II. So I think that pretty much sums it up. I've discussed battery life, autofocus performance, Wi-Fi and NFC, Rock-Solid, just like basically every generation before it. Sony constantly updating the library, adding new apps, which is critical. You can't sell a library of applications if you aren't going to actually update it and foster it. Otherwise, you're just selling an empty shell, basically spoofing the customer. So that is luckily something Sony has stuck with and developed. So even though other manufacturers will give you a free app or two built in with the camera, Sony really allows you to expand and do a whole host of different things that is way ahead of the competition, in my opinion. Even though Sammy has some interesting products with Android involved, which I wish Sony would incorporate, especially with their Android TVs now. Hopefully, we're going to see something like that happen in the future, get a more modern A7 Mark II lineup, if that makes any sense, in terms of the processing power. And maybe that's where the 4K comes into play, especially since now they've got 4K action cams already, please. But the A7 Mark II is a winner as a photography tool first. Video, still far from being my favorite. And that's why I wouldn't recommend it as an upgrade for anyone who owns an A7 or A7R and actually was looking to get more video performance. But as a still camera, the stabilization is top-notch. You're still getting great performance. The improved algorithms from the A6000 for the autofocus and focus tracking. And basically the best camera money can buy in the full frame world, especially mirrorless and still quite light, even though it is 30% heavier than the original A7. So a lot to like here. Of course, audio in and out on this thing for monitoring and microphone, HDMI I mentioned before, 4K output. You can capture, of course, as well as charge your battery through their micro USB dubbed multi-port, which has optional accessories. But overall, nothing to dislike about the Mark II. Sony doing yet again what we expect them to, which is set the standard for expectations in terms of a zero compromise performance package that is lightweight, even though this one happens to be heavier than anything before it. So a lot to like here with the Mark II. Hope you enjoyed the review. I think it's a great camera. Again, for me personally, the grip, the video quality, not enough to bring me to buy an additional E-mount body. When they put out something with 4K that's captured internally, that's when I'm going to add something, and the R will become a backup rather than a primary complement to the balance of my arsenal, which is really the RX1 and the A6000, complete with all of my E-mount lenses, both APS-C as well as full frame. So I hope that helps all of you that are trying to decide. E-mount glass is inexpensive, but the full frame stuff isn't. So again, if you've got a lot of glass, the Mark II is a good way to go. If you don't, you might want to hang out a little bit, wait for a sale, or just pick up one of the first gen A7s, any from the lineup, frankly, because they are all fantastic. And the boost in autofocus is there, but it's not really enough for me, again, personally, to say, you know what, I need that. Had it been A6000 type autofocus boost, then we'd be in business. And I have a feeling Sony will be bringing that, but that's yet another offering for another clientele. Of course, I feel that we all want these features, but Sony is in a business to make a profit, so that's probably why things are segmented, as they always have been. They don't want to cannibalize their own business. I can't really blame them. I'm just glad somebody is still innovating. But Sony has fallen behind with the 4K stuff, so hopefully they catch up. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. And of course, as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.